want to mention in terms of logistics. Gracias, Ariana. And just want to mention in terms of logistics, there'll be segments when we have discussion, especially breakouts, and I want to make it as purposeful and interactive as I can. And those will not be recorded. So Ariana will be pausing the recording so we can actually have conversation. Very likely there'll be context that you bring to this space from your own teaching spaces. So we want to make sure that we honor that privacy. All right. So again, gracias, Ariana, for your invitation. It's really an honor to hold space with any and all teachers that are doing ethics studies to whatever degree. I just want to keep it real. I think we're living in very tumultuous times, and so our commitment to ethics studies, the pedagogies of love, the pedagogies of reclaiming of self, the criticality, especially in these times. If people thought ethics studies wasn't relevant 2 decades ago, how can it not be? And how can we not have it all the way from pre-K and on? It doesn't have to be a high school curriculum, and it doesn't have to be something that was a struggle for only at the college university level. But the task I have here is I want to bridge several aspects today. And so the overview that you have, it's a 2 hour convening, and I'm going to do my best to kind of chunk it a little bit. So we have some plática conversation, small groups, and then we come together, whole group. Depending on how that unfolds, sometimes I'm going to ask people to just drop in the chat some ideas. So that way the rhythm continues. And I want to make sure I do cover what I want to cover. So the three big areas, it's an overview of ethics studies, curriculum, and pedagogy. So foundational stuff. Folks here are in different places. I know some of you are in Cal State, some are community colleges, some are high school, and we do have a middle school. And there's others, a couple of people who wrote others. So, but I think it's important to lay the groundwork. This may be something you already know from over the years, and that's a blessing. If you are a product of ethics studies as a student, you learned all these things, we're super grounded. That's a blessing. But I don't want to assume that. So I'm going to cover some foundational stuff. And then what I want us to move us into is a sharing of curriculum, have conversation around classroom practices. I'm going to do a Padlet activity where we're kind of doing a little bit of a scavenger hunt. So I was a middle school teacher, and so these are kind of activities where we're going to go into look at a bigger set of units by the Puente project. And we're going to excavate those, and you're going to have conversations about what you're seeing, what are examples of key concepts of ethnic studies, and what interests you that you can use in your classes. So that's part of that sharing. And then the last component is the bridging, the alignment between high schools, the K-12 environment, and community colleges. And we have some CSU folks. So that's going to be important as well. But what could that alignment look like? And what I'm thinking of doing is towards the end, make it a little more participatory rather than me prescribing like this is what you need to do. I think we have people here already. So I'm intentionally set people up in groups who are not all college, going to mix you up with high school K-12 and with college and have those generative pláticas. So that's what we have for today. And I think, you know what, I also want to say at any moment, feel free to drop in the chat ideas that emerge. Let's be as interactive as possible. I know that it flattens out the kind of way we discourse because I'm talking to a screen, but I see faces, which is great that I'm seeing that. But at any moment, if there's something really important, do a raise of the hand. You know, that's important. It's not interrupting, it's part of the learning. Um, okay, so I want to begin today, like I do my classes, with a land acknowledgement. This is one of many, and I use this currently at UC Riverside, but I also use it when I do professional development with high school teachers. So I'm going to read this. I think it's very important. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life. And some have lived on this land for more generations that can be counted. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We're currently occupying the ancestral lands in Modesto, the Miwok and Yokuts people. And where I'm at is the Tongva people. I'm in the LA area. So in our work to promote social justice in ed, we must always consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here today. And I want to add an important proviso that when we do the land acknowledgement, we also recognize limitations. What does that mean to have a symbolic sort of representation of that? But because storytelling is important to what we do in ethnic studies, what I do in my classes, this is part of what I frame as a decolonial story, a story that has not been told, the story that's erased. My daughter, and I'll speak a little bit of her history, and my son, they don't get taught these things. So the fact that there's an acknowledgement is the beginning of something, the seeds of a consciousness, but it does not give land back. I want to recognize that. I'm not naive to that because I know those are sometimes in my campus, they'll put this on there and it's like a check off. Okay, we're ready, we're done. No, we're not ready, we're done. On whose land are we on and what can UCR do better? And I also begin classes with the In Lakesh. So I'm going to invite people who want to take the risk to unmute themselves, and we will read the In Lakesh together from top to bottom. And just want to give a little bit of context. Comes from Pensamiento Serpentino, Luis Valdez. And I'm glad this is being recorded because as much as Gavin Newsom and company and in the state in Sacramento have actually said that this is, I don't know if you caught it. So it's kind of like we're not supposed to teach the In Lakesh. There's also a Yoruba chant. And this was a sort of Xing out of the initial sort of model ethic studies curriculum. But the misconception was that this is teaching one religion and that this is Aztec. And I don't use the term Aztec, I use Nahuatl. But they need to take ethic studies, including our governor, because this comes, if anything, is rooted in Mayan epistemologies. And yes, there may be common ground with Mexica peoples, but let's not equivocate that. It's like your students. If you have students, the Guatemalteco in background, you say, hey, you're Mexican, Mexican American, they're going to have a strong reaction. And I know those are nationalist categories, but I just trip on that. Like our own political leaders are not aware of the histories of these things and they just jump on these bandwagons. So um, on the count of three, whoever wants to take a risk, we'll try this together and we'll start with the title. 1, 2, 3. In la que
Lakesh,
tú
tú
eres
eres
mi
mi
otro
otro
yo.
yo.
You are my
You are my
other
other
me.
me.
Si te
Si te
hago
hago
daño
daño
a
a
ti,
ti,
if
if
I
I
do
do
harm to
harm to
you,
you,
me
me
hago
hago
daño a mí
daño a mí
mismo.
mismo.
I do
I do
harm to
harm to
myself.
myself.
Si te
Si te
amo y
amo y
respeto,
respeto,
if I
if
love
I
and
love and
respect
respect
you,
you,
me amo
me
y
amo y
respeto yo.
respeto yo.
I love and
I love and
respect
respect
myself.
myself.
Thank you for that. And it's good hearing your voices and, just sometimes in a class, in the context. So I've taught ethics studies with high school youth in various contexts, mostly in summer programs. When I was a public school teacher, we didn't have ethics studies in the K-12. And we had multicultural ed and some things happened with it that it didn't turn for the better. But when I do this in my college university setting, sometimes it turns into a 20-minute healing circle. It's just as simple as like checking in. How are we doing? How are we not connected? How are we feeling? Right. And even within ourselves, there are multiple selves and there's mind, body, and spirit. So this can go into very deep conversations, but this could be a community builder. It's interactive and ritual and routine for how we begin a class. And it's part of a legacy of ethnic studies pedagogies. Um, and just to share some current projects I've been involved in, and Ariana spoke about some of these. The Journal Ethic Studies Pedagogies is one. It's an open, free access. I believe we have some colegas here who have published in it. This is a space for teachers, activists, scholar activists. It's not just a high academic journal, and it's run by an editorial board that's not just people in universities. So if you're interested, shoot me an email. I'll provide all that information through Ariana. This is a space that we're trying to grow to create resources, reflection, scholarship, pedagogy, so that we're able to share those. The latest is a high school ethnic studies, a resource book, and gracias, Ariana, through the grant in your college, you're able to bequeath some of these. Also sharing pictures of projects. So we do our stories, our lives, our communities, conferencia. Brings in a whole bunch of our students. We're going to do it in spring. It's going to be the second annual. That flyer was the first iteration. It happened in June. We're going to do it again, and it's using ethic studies and a little bit of action research for students where I'm situated is in Riverside. And for students in Riverside to study conditions and problems impacting their comunidades and to study those intentionally and coming together. And then that last picture upper right, that was at Cal State LA. I did a lot of literacies in the urban comunidades, and I'll later share a little bit of a unit. We can do a lot at all levels with children's picture books. Let me repeat that. We can do a lot at all levels with children's picture books. Sometimes the narratives are, well, this is elementary. No, even in college, like it's anywhere. Powerful themes that come to life. It's how we bridge. But there you see some of my students reading these to each other, talking about the lessons, and they would go out in the field and work with children and youth to create these stories. So let me now move on to the next slide. So I want us to do brief introductions. If you can do this in the chat, because I want to be mindful of time, and this can easily take us 25 minutes. But if you can drop in the chat your name and pronouns and your institutional affiliation, and I know some of you already have that in what's your name. Um, Also, what brings you to this learning space? And this last question, why is ethnic studies important to you? So if you can please drop that in the chat and we'll all collectively read through some of this. Let's take about a minute, pause, and as people populate the chat. So just a little bit about myself, and this is on one side of my family, and it's about ethnic studies. Where we come from matters fundamentally in everything we do. And so for me, this is a picture on the upper left of my abuelito. He's the man from left to right. He's a little bit older too, and he's the second man wearing a hat. And so this is around 1962, Utah. He was here as a bracero, and so we have a lot of stories from my mom. How he would be gone, he would come back, and then at some point he learned English, and then in 1986, we have this picture of him in La Pizca de Cacahuates in Zacatecas, Jalpa. I don't know if people know those regions of Mexico. And so they're working there. And I also am sharing another photo on the lower left. This is my Aunt Socorro's workstation around 2008. And at that time, I was doing a qualitative kind of exercise as part of a class in my doctoral studies to look at a setting and the meaning that people give to things. And so my mom has been in the garment industry for about 50 years. She's retired. She worked as a garment worker for about 35, and then she was manager in the latter parts of her career. But it was interesting when I asked my tia about the meaning of what is in the middle. So you see the máquina de coser, and right in the middle is the Virgen de Guadalupe. And I thought my aunt was gonna get all spiritual, and she said, "Look, most of the day we're just bending down, right? That you're sewing, looking down is very noisy, 50, 60 machines going at once. She looks up a moment to breathe, so to speak, a pause, and she sees that. And what she sees is her family. And so I thought it was stayed with me for a while, a long time to think about how sacred family is. And that in the end of the day, in her own words, like there is a finality to this. And I go home to my family, as exploitative as it is. And so it's survival capitalism, but the meaning that people give. And so this is a part of my root, and I never forget that when I'm in a university setting. There's other stories I have. I have a PhD, but what does that really mean? And so during the pandemic, we were trying to build a pergola, like a shade in the back. And my dad had done construction work for a large part of his life. And so he's older. And my dad made me be the worker, and I can physically, it took forever though, in my little SUV bringing 15 footers. But luckily the Home Depot was 3 blocks away, but it took forever, like 4 weeks bringing the stuff back and forth, laid everything out. And then my dad said, ¿Y ahora qué? And I looked back at him, I shrugged my shoulders, and then my dad tells me, Tienes un doctorado, pero no sabes hacer nada. Translation, you have a doctorate, but you don't know how to do anything. Because it's my father and we have a big, strong sense of trust, that's humility teaching. It's like you have your PhD in that area, but my dad's like, step over, I have my PhD. So now you're going to assume the peon worker, and I now learn how to build pergolas for $600 rather than $12,000. But the materials are more expensive, so maybe it's double the price. But where we come from matters, and I'm a little bit of storytelling to give you a sense of who I am, the humanity that we all bring to the spaces that we're a part of. Um, One of the things I want to share in thinking about this webinar and also any professional development I do is this idea of pillars, foundational practices that make up who we are as ethics studies, critical race educators, maybe decolonial scholars, whatever are those signifiers. And this is my coming to frame this. It's not meant to be the framework, the five pillars. It's not meant to be that. You may find things that overlap, the categories are not adequate, there's a whole other area, but this is how I'm coming to this space. And when we think about developing ourselves of ethics as ethics studies educators, on the upper left, we need to be grounded in that content knowledge. And so many of us may not have had the benefit of being an undergraduate who had that apprenticeship. So later in life, that's what's happening. We're getting a master's. I know some teachers are pursuing those post-bac certificates. They're all over the state now, and they're run mostly by CSUs, although some private universities are doing it. But that's one important thing is the content knowledge. And how do we build it? The other is institutional knowledge, the upper right, the histories of schools and schooling systems. I'm going to add the histories of higher education, how all these things interlock with power. Here's another way to say it when I work with teachers. We need the tools, the herramientas to learn how to navigate these spaces too. You're doing ethics studies, especially now, and it's under attack. It's very deliberately under attack. It doesn't even have to be called ethics studies anymore. Maybe the framing is DEI and then it encompasses that. But how do we navigate that? How do we build that? At the very center, I put in a bigger quadrant is pedagogical knowledge. That's the culturally relevant, rooting, responsive. How do we flow? How do we scaffold things? How do we break things down? That's the process of mediation. That whole teaching process, it's at the center of it, but it's not definitive. And so what we have at the very bottom is self-knowledge and community knowledge. And I really see those as the pillars. I maybe need a different way of representing it, but they're in the bottom because they're holding the rest. I can have all the expertise in ethnic studies, in Chicanx studies. So I see myself as Chicano, Mexicano, right? I may have all this knowledge of this is how institutions operate. I've gone through four universities and I know how to navigate them up to a certain extent, right? And I have the pedagogies and I've been doing it for 20 years, teacher education. But if I'm not grounded in who I am, if I don't know who I am, if I have misconceptions as a brown man to think that I'm white, or I subscribe to very deficit ideas about myself and my comunidad, and that's the community knowledge. If I don't have those two, I cannot do the other. The other is really performative, it's procedural, it's technocratic. It doesn't have the life, it doesn't have the process of having students be seen because I won't be there. And all of you know that with our students, when I taught middle school, you can't fake it. Kids know when you're, it know, they know. So at some point, we got to come real with who we are. And being who we are doesn't mean you have to be one of these categories. I also want to honor everybody's identities and places of where they come from. I'm trying to voice in the spirit of ethic studies. And but I want to leave you with this framework to think about as we walk through today. And I will have some pláticas, but this is part of foundational. Let's hold this quadrant. And what I'm also going to do at the very end, there's some things I'm going to drop in the chat as resources, especially what we're going to use as tools. There's the hallmark of ethics studies we're going to use soon. I'll drop them. But at the very end, everybody who registered is going to get all the resources I drop in the chat, but more because there's more of what I'm presenting, including the presentation slides. You're going to get those as well. So um, I use the pillars for self-reflection when I do PD. We're not going to do this exercise now, but it's something to think about. Like, how would I rate my knowledge and proficiency in this area? What are strengths that I bring as an educator with respect to these knowledge and proficiencies? What are areas that I need to nurture and develop? And what resources, spaces, strategies are needed to grow in each area? So again, it's a tool of self-reflection, and none of us are in a stage where, okay, I'm at five, I'm done. I would actually say, like for me, I'm still developing my ethics studies content knowledge. And I need to learn more actually about Asian American studies. As a community where I live, we have Asian communities here present. Do I understand their histories? No, I don't. I need to strengthen what I know. Um, I need to develop my sense of community knowledge. what I mean by that is not so much my comunidad. That's too easy to say. But now that I've moved and teach in the UC Riverside area, that many people refer to as IE, the Inland Empire, the Inland Region. What is it that I don't know? And we just learned with our students as they were doing their action research projects because they're studying issues. One of the major tropes is warehouseification. So the warehouses that are growing, and some of you understand the area and how Amazon and all these industries have come in for the last 2, 3 decades, and it's just removing communities. It's literally causing harm. And it's like what I would use the concept is racial capitalism 2.0. And so, but I don't understand that to the extent that they do and that they lived. I don't understand that displacement. So, how do I develop it? And part of it could be processes of self-study, looking for courses. It can also be through our pedagogies, like what I'm doing with our students, action research that informs and guides us and teaches us of where we can go and where we can be. So, I want to take a little pause here and transition into why we need ethics studies and why ethics studies is vital to what we do and why it's important. And I want to begin with the story of my daughter. And I'm doing this because it's been a long journey of love and care for her. Anybody who's a parent, a caretaker, you've been a tia, an aunt, an uncle, or your friends, close friends, and you see yourself as familia. But I don't think we do enough in schools. I don't think we're close to not even 5%. I wish we should be doing. And we have all this training, and I've been doing it, but what are the outcomes when you have this very continued neoliberal education, standards driven, all that stuff is still here. But these are quotes, her kindergarten teacher. She is behind other student. Her name's Amarilis. And then in second grade, she struggles with focusing. And what happens by fourth grade, my daughter, I don't like school, papi. And I still remember one day she didn't go. She created her first YouTube video. And this was, I think it was second grade. And it was a video of all her dolls coming together and they all ditched school and they were in the backyard and they were having fun. And I was thinking, I'm not trained in psychology, but what would a psychologist say? A child who is having so much joy and the dolls, maybe as projection, are like in a space of joy outside of school. What does that tell us about school and how she's experiencing it? And any of you who have read Transformative Ethics Studies in School, this is the beginning of the book. This is the beginning of the story. And there you have Amarilis in the backyard drawing. But her story isn't the story that's just for her, about her, what schools have done. It's a story that could be a story that you all connect to. I connect to some degree. It's a story that many other students connect to, especially kids of color in the schooling apparatus. But one of the things I want to say is that not once in that elementary school trajectory did people bother to inquire about the academic curiosity, the cultural forms of production that Amarilis has. Not once. And we as parents met with these teachers. There were a lot of meetings to try to understand, not to come in and say, well, what's wrong with you? But like, how can we work together? And there's many stories I have as a as a Chicano coming in and being also racialized by teachers and union being called because we were asking the wrong questions. This is just problematic. And even though I love the work of teacher education, I've also learned there are educators who probably shouldn't be in the classroom. And it's more harm you're doing rather than even the basics of teaching them what they need to learn. But these are images of the different forms of cultural production for Amarilis. That picture on the upper left was taken during the Women's March. I don't know if you remember the first presidency, the comes into power, and then all the women's marches that ensued. And this is what she did. We, the people, protect each other. There was no script. Kids were hanging out. It was mostly professors, community college folks too. And we went to the marcha. This is in Orange County, Southern California. And she has a mouse in the center. The mouse is the heart. It says, even a mouse. And then however you are. And later I had a conversation, it's like a very non-ethnocentric view of the world, a valuing of life. I have chickens, I have rats, and I want to get rid of them. And so I'm having a hard time because her onto epistemology, her way of valuing things is different. On the bottom left is the very first mariachi concert. She's a beautiful singer. I'm not making it up just because they're always telling her to come and sing in schools, but nobody's bothering to tap into the musicality, especially a child. Bottom right, the marchas. Back then, I used to do a lot of more activism. I don't do as much. My work is mostly in the classroom, but they were like fish in water. They'll go up there, fight the power. My son's right there with the little Batman. That day, by the way, my son got lost and I got in a lot of trouble with my compañera. But a fish in water, fight the power, the chants, right? That's a literacy. And then there's Amarilis. We moved her through about four different schools. We had the privilege. We also had to move homes. And then she started thriving, a different environment, different teachers. So, but what I want to begin with is just for me, the why of ethnic studies is very personal. The personal is at home. It is political and it's very emotional for me now. We're going through a very hard time as a familia, but that's a part of what we do in our humanity. We keep forward. And I'm going to continue to develop and do what we need to do as ethnic studies. But I want us to also hear the story of Sakina Shabazz. I was a part of the Association of Raza Educators. This is one of the keynotes, and I'm going to put maybe about a minute and a half, not the entire plática, the keynote. This is a high school student that comes from Lincoln High School in San Diego who was invited to keynote. So that's one of the things we need to rupture, right? The idea, oh, the keynotes are going to get all these people with degrees. No, what about our youth as a voice? What can they teach us? So Sakina Shabazz is going to share some words, and I want you to think about the why ethnic studies from the perspective of an African American student, activista, and why ethnic studies matter. So I'm going to hit play, then I'm going to move a little bit forward. And again, why ethnic studies? Why do we need it? Here we go. The audio should.
I would like to thank Adi for having me here today. It really is an honor to speak in front of all these beautiful people and all my comrades. Gracias por invitarme, es un gran honor. We have been brought here today to further the building of our communities, not just general welfare, but to build ones that are free of the oppression that exists in and around them and is safe for those who live there. We people of color have been stripped of our native roots and had them replaced with the colonized beliefs of those who are foolishly driven by greed, money, and the power of false dominance. There is a place where you can be taught about this history of your people and those who came before you, but that education is denied to you and I. Instead, that place is used to keep us mentally chained. It teaches us that we have no part in history. It reminds us that our leaders are dead and gone, and that we should worship those who killed them. We are not given the respect that we deserve as our people, and we are told that our ancestors were nothing but slaves and savages. This place that I am describing is called school, but it's better described as a place of containment where the ideas of the oppressor are freely welcomed and the respect and culture of their students are swept underneath the blue carpet in the classroom. Because places like this exist, another barrier is put up that will keep us from our liberation as a people and keep us from knowing the truth about those who tell lies about us. But because many of us are gathered here today in this very place, we are slowly taking the steps to exposing this colonial education that we as students are forced to receive. By exposing it and changing it to better fit the needs of the students, we will essentially contribute to the mental and physical freedom of our people and will be a step closer to our liberation. Within this institution that we call school, there mainly exists the student and the teacher. The education that we as students are forced to receive is a colonial education that has been passed down throughout the years with a lie or two added here or there. This education, especially in history classes, can be proven to perpetuate racism and self-hatred. I'd like to share a quick story about my third period world history class at Lincoln High School, and this is a perfect example of how racism is perpetuated in our education. My teacher and I got into a discussion about the imperialism and colonialism that took place in Africa after the Industrial Revolution. And after stating my point about how African people were doing just fine on their land and how they were highly developed politically and economically, my teacher, without any remorse, continued by stating that Anglo-Saxons were the dominant race and that they were more advanced than any other race that existed.
What?
Stating this as if she were a woman of European descent, she tried to justify the enslavement, rape, torture, theft, and colonization of our African people because they were white. And to top it off, she is an African teacher. This is proof that the education that is shoved down our throats is racist and caters to the European race. And what is more blatant is that most teachers are just as colonized, if not more, than the students they are teaching. How can we build?
So all forward there, and you, I hope you feel the force and the strength of her talk, and very reflexive, but naming colonization and schooling as intermittently connected, and that is the historical experience of schooling. And scholars have talked about this, Joe Springs, as a process of deculturalization. As a native scholar, he studies what happened during the Native American boarding schools, but he also talks about it in Deculturalization: A Struggle for Equality. It's a book that I use a lot in Teacher Ed over the years. He looks at other racialized groups and how that's happened, but a sort of removing of one's culture. It's what Richard Valencia says is tied to eugenics and these racist ideas about deficit notions about communities of color, especially students of color in the schools. So somebody like my daughter, instead of seeing the assets, we default to saying something's wrong with her or what's wrong with the parents. The other is what Angela Valenzuela termed the subtractive schooling. You're coming into school, but rather than being additive, so yeah, you learn arithmetic and you learn some literacy, although in some contexts, not even that do our students get. But this something's been taken away about who you are. And so this is a present historical moment that has been shaped historically by forces that we're living in. And I have these images. The lower right, you see the Central American kids in cages. They're still in cages. They have not been freed. And it doesn't matter almost what political party. A lot of people think, oh, this is just one party. This is a long-standing history that's also targeting Asian communities, the Asian hate. We had the Black Lives Matter movement. We still have it as a response to anti-Blackness. We finally now have that registered. Anti-Blackness is pervasive in our society, and we need to reckon with it. And so the other pictures there, all we want is our stories to be told. The role that schools play in the curriculum that's Eurocentric and that denies these histories, but also denies teachers an opportunity to teach these histories. Um, and in the words of Bettina Love, I quote her, she says, "We who are dark want to matter and live, not just to survive, but to thrive. Matter not for recognition or acknowledgement, but to create new systems and its structures for educational, political, economic, and community freedom. We want to be seen. We want to matter." And so ethnic studies um, is a vibrant movement. It's a movimiento that's been alive in California for a while. Other states are taking it on, but I think California has been on the cusp of it. And this is just a short list. And I should have put dot, dot, dot. It keeps going. But those of you who are privy to, were involved initially, remember 2014, El Rancho Unified, and then LA and all the big districts, and it kept going, making ethnic studies a graduation requirement. Some like San Diego Unified, extending it beyond high school, talking about an entire K-12 curriculum. How beautiful that is. And you can Google it if you're not familiar. Type in ethnic studies resources, San Diego Unified, boom, you're going to go into a beautiful page. It's probably going to be one of the first two that has been curated by teachers, but also in dialogue with experts in the community colleges and universities. We had AB 2016, and that gives us a model ethnic studies curriculum. For the purpose of this planting, I'm not getting into the contentious aspects of it, but every curriculum is contested, even the one you're teaching now. And so the same with AB 2016, but there's some framework where there wasn't one, although some folks would argue it's useless. Um, then AB 101 in 2021, we get the ethnic studies graduation requirement passed. So this has been a vibrant movement in California. And I'm just going to share a couple of clips of that movement across different spaces.
The transformative possibilities of a high school ethnic studies class in Orange County. And I'd love, once I finish that, to give a copy of it to all of you. Okay, the research, qualitative, quantitative, the research suggests that ethnic studies, you want to close the achievement gap for students here in Santa Ana? Okay, bring ethnic studies. Okay, the research, it's clear that if taught right,
and that's Dr. Macalas. He's been a colega while I was at Cal CLA, and he taught high school ethnic studies for some years. at Loara High School and then does teacher education and is doing a lot of our ethnic studies pedagogies classes at Cal State LA. Um, I'm gonna share this one's like it's about 3 minutes, super important. This isn't just in California, but it's a powerful piece of a larger documentary. And what I wanted you to pay attention to is the perspectives of the teachers and the students. It's like the question I asked you, what brings you to ethnic studies? Let's get this from the stories of people doing the work and how do they interpret the bigger meaning of ethnic studies. Let me hit play. Here we go.
They will stare, so strut your stuff. They will judge, so show them what's up. They will assume, so tell them the truth. They will mock, so tell them to back off. They will look down on you, so keep your head held high. They will say you don't belong, so show them that they're wrong. They will try to put you behind a line, so step over it and show them that what they say are lies. They will try to tell you that you're not worth it, but always remember that you are perfect. So stand tall because you are strong and fierce, and never forget that God put you here with love in his heart that can never be torn apart. How to be both Puerto Rican and a woman.
Ethnic studies is very welcoming,
humanizing,
authentic,
transformative,
engaging,
passionate, and open,
illuminating.
Ethnic studies is empowerment.
Empowerment.
I would say community.
Community.
Respect.
Hope. Ethnic studies is love.
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 Beautiful. Ethnic studies is beautiful.
Holyoke is such a special and important city for a whole variety of reasons, but in the contemporary moment it's often mischaracterized as being a city in decline.
It really gives into this stigma that we have in Holyoke that you have to get out of here. You know, this is not the place that you really should want to be in.
One of the things that's missed in these narratives around Holyoke as being a quote-unquote city in decline is its rich and vibrant history. And so one of the reasons that ethnic studies is particularly important in this city is it helps us to kind of address some of these misrepresentations, erasures.
When we look at it from a historical lens, schools have not been an inviting place that really embraces the lived experiences of marginalized communities. Historically, schools have been a place where familial and cultural values and histories and practices that are outside of what would be considered the norm were chastised or often erased in the classroom.
I think that one of the reasons that ethnic studies is so important in Holyoke, particularly for young people, is that it allows them to confront these often racist stereotypes and depictions of their families, of their communities that are really dominant in a way that they have a set of tools and vocabulary to better understand their own people in a way that not only challenges, but dismantles and deconstructs the dominant narratives.
Generationally, part of what has been missing is students being able to identify or see themselves in what they're learning. When I go co-teach or be a teacher for the day in the ethnic studies classes, what I love is sort of the give and take, the students asking real critical questions or saying, well, I lived in the flats and here's my experience, right? Or when I say a story, they're like, hey, I kind of have heard my mom say that before. You know, all of a sudden their experience and their history matters.
I think this is an important moment for thinking about Holyoke in the context of all the struggles that are happening nationally around who are we, who gets to belong, what stories do we get to tell. That kind of storytelling is codified in school, in curriculum, right? We institutionalize the stories that we want to tell about a culture, which is how culture gets passed in the big picture.
This is just a clip, but I highly recommend, and I'll send this to with Ariana, the bigger documentary that's available on YouTube. It's powerful to watch in your classes, amongst educators, community college, high school, all these levels. it brings to life all these aspects of what ethic studies could become. And I tend to reframe it as like the spiritual work and the spiritual calling of ethic studies. And it's not just a teaching, it's not just that, it's beyond even a career. Um, so I'm gonna transition now to thinking about the curriculum. And now I'm, as promised, there will be a Padlet. I'm gonna have people work in smaller groups, just make it more interactive. But what I've been doing is laying out foundations. At this stage is the why ethic studies. But what is ethic studies? And I want to own this from my positionality again as a Chicano, Mexican American doing teacher education and the ways I've come to study and reflect on my own teaching to begin to define what ethic studies is. This is not meant to be the definitive definition of it. If anything, what ethics studies can become is going to be based on the context in which you're situated. But some working understanding, a working definition is important. So this is one, and this is from actually the book that Christine Sleater and I co-authored. Ethics studies is a movement for curricular and pedagogical projects that reclaim marginalized voices and histories, create spaces of healing, which are tied to social action that challenges and transforms oppressive systems and cultures of domination. So it's about nurturing students' racial literacies and their cultural identities. It's about reclaiming those things. But I would argue as well, it's about fostering student academic literacies, just the access to education at all levels, even though that education is colonial. I think parts of the struggle to make inroads for communities who were denied access to higher education, denied access to high school. Think about the push out and the histories of that. So I see this as a dual kind of bigger goal. It's this reclaiming work, but it's about nurturing as well, both self, but also the tools and resources that make us academically literate. And in terms of curriculum, this is one working framework you can think about. We can start anywhere. It's social justice teaching that has to do with contextualizing the stories that we read about, the histories. It's anti-racist, intersectional, and has been from its genesis, because I know that's been a misconception at Crítica, that it's only working with race. What about class? What about all these forms of oppression? No, it takes all these into account. It has ethics studies content for it to be ethics studies. It's kind of like repetitive, but it's important to name it. If you remove literally the bottom part, then it's not ethics studies. It's critical pedagogy. It's social justice ped. It's something else. It has social action and civic engagement as a commitment. Now, the social action, civic engagement, things we've seen are youth participatory action research, where you can join your ethnic studies together with the study of issues in comunidades, where students then move on from inquiry to action. That's one way to think about it. But I also want to argue that self-reflection and going deep with self is also a commitment to social action. In other words, it doesn't have to be in the streets, using that metaphor. And I'm going to share a schooling biographies project I've done as part of ethics studies with high school students, where we go deep with reflection in our own schooling that I think is integral to this civic engagement, social action within ourselves. In other volumes, I'm thinking here, rethinking ethics studies, and there's a cover of it, an image. We kind of laid a framework to think about ethics studies. And sorry about the arrows. They don't have to be arrows. Maybe they're just, it's all circles, but indigeneity and roots. So what themes are we going to address? What lessons are tied to that macro scale of indigeneity and roots? The other is coloniality, dehumanization, and genocide. In the present moment we find ourselves in, and in working with teachers, doing teacher ed in other areas that are not close to Modesto, the coloniality, dehumanization, genocide, they've already told them, let's not talk about that. What are you going to do with genocide? Talk about Palestinians, it's anti-Semitic. These are like these such policing tropes. But then administrators supposedly trigger, like, what is that going to cause? Dehumanizing. Let's transcend that. Let's just jump to decoloniality, but they're not going to use decoloniality. That's the bottom. Let's talk about regeneration and community love. That is important. But I think without the process of naming the historical conditions of colonization, other forms of oppression, we're not doing that deep work. Where some teachers begin is with hegemony normalization. And I've done units working with youth that begin there. Why? Because it's usually a study of the historical processes that are in the present through institutions. So, for example, social media. How does it reproduce patriarchal orders? Give a working definition of patriarchy. Youth students are going to have all kinds of examples of social media. Institutions, your own schooling, boom. So sometimes hegemony normalization is a quote unquote beginning. We think of bigger units, but then we go into the history. But these see them as dimensions. They're energies that I define are part of an ethnic studies curriculum. So and then it gets a little more complicated. This is what we did. So I'm gonna have an exercise right now. We're gonna do breakouts, but I'm gonna give you this handout in a bit. And this is from Transformative Ethics Studies in Schools. And so Christine Sleeter and I came up with this notion of hallmarks. Again, not definitive. We're actually about to finish the second edition of that book that's gonna enrich this. But one of those is curriculum as counter narrative, curriculum from the perspective of communities of color, the communities who have not been heard. Criticality. If we don't have criticality, a structural analysis of race, racism, other forms of oppression, it ain't ethic studies. A curriculum needs this. It's a reclaiming of cultural identities. It's intersectional. It's about community engagement. It's culture responsive. And this last piece, super important. It's a pedagogy of care and attunement to students as intellectuals, students as geniuses, and going through those exercises as a teacher. And also, this isn't easy because you may come with this from the beginning, and there's some students who don't buy it because they've never been told that. And so then they're going to challenge you. I'm dumb, teacher. What are you talking about? I have F's. Like, but the system has created these categories. But the true genius lies within each one of us. How do we tap into that? How do we come to the class seeing that and lift our students, whoever they are, into that next stage? So I'll drop these hallmarks. But here's what I want us to do as a table talk in small groups is I want you to select two of these hallmarks and I want you to discuss the ways you have experienced, taught, or engaged with these hallmarks in any way, shape, or form. So don't think of all of them, but focus on two. And then how have you experienced, taught, engaged with any of them? And then what learning and rehumanizing spaces do you think these two hallmarks engender? Do they help nurture? Do they help create? But I always ask this question number four, because it's good to be reflexive. What challenges do you think might exist? Do you foresee or have encountered if you've already taught, say, with criticality and you're doing critical race stuff in designing lessons informed by these hallmarks? But let me reframe this. Number four, don't think so much of design, think of the implementation too. So again, you're going to select two hallmarks, and I'll drop these right now. You're going to discuss the ways that you have connected to those two, and then think about the possibility of those hallmarks, but also the constraints, especially because we teach in context and that are highly institutionalized for the most part. So let me hit stop, and this is going to be our first table talk, and then we can stop recording. Okay, so welcome everybody, and I jumped in the rooms, got a good sense of the kinds of larger units you're interested in and the reasons why. Also want to apologize. I guess a lot of these links, they're not operational. And so, Ariana, I do have permission, and I'll later talk with you about it because I do have the archive and I think people should have it. Like I said, a lot of amazing educators from college together with high school have come together to create these units. And so that Padlet, though, let's keep it as an archive of the generating ideas, of the ideas that have come together to think about what are the hallmarks, what are key concepts. Again, it's an exercise to be a little more nuanced about lesson design and thinking about ethics studies. So what I want to speak to is this notion of what these pedagogies mean. And I want to start showing actual examples. And so we're looking at the present historical moment, the deportations, persecution, that is historical in nature. How do we come to analyze that in our high school ethics studies class, in our community college class? How is it that we approach it? And so, the way I do it, one way is to think about the key concepts and frameworks that allow us to understand phenomena that can be dehistoricized, that can be seen as being in isolation, that's not seen as a repetition of something else. And so, I would probably begin with this very concept of deculturalization. And so, what I do in teaching about this is we work with foundational definitions. So those are the ones you have. And then I worked through a definition. I would read probably excerpts, if not the entire chapter by Joe Spring, especially where he's talking about boarding schools and the deculturalization that was happening in those sites as it impacted Native Americans. So we have a concept. And how would I break out the readings? I would have maybe students interact with this through what's called the concept quadrant activity. And this activity and handout I will also make available. It's a tool, but it allows students to go through a closed text analysis. And you see the four quadrants, the upper left, the definition or quote related to this concept. Um, then we have my own understanding of this concept. So the assumption is you've read some text. Then there's number three, a visual drawing sketch of this concept. And four, questions I have about the concept. And I'll show you an example. You can do this at all levels. I did this with teachers, by the way. This is an example. So definition, deculturalization is in the center. It's a conscious attempt to replace one culture and language with another that is considered superior, abbreviated. Their understanding of the experience, dominance, hegemony, historical, deeply rooted, on and on. Look at the visual. This is where you get students tapping into the different modalities, right? The cutting of the hair. Then there's institutions that are perpetuating this process and questions they have. How do we reculturalize, if there's such a thing? How can we be more conscious about restoring culture, and how do we disrupt concepts of superiority? So these were teachers in a different PD, but you get the sense of how you can scaffold a concept that has us understand bigger things. But then what I would do, I like to use other media like film. I don't know if you're familiar with Rabbit Proof Fence. It's a powerful film that is about the context of Aborigines in Australia. And one might ask, well, why aren't we doing about films if we're looking at the deportations here? Because I think we can do those cross connections. I don't even use the word international, but it's a powerful film. And then I have questions that I have students think about, like, where do you see deculturalization? We also would study deficit thinking, like, how are those evident? And then we would show aspects of that film, maybe not the entire film, but maybe about 15, 20 selected clips. It's a very powerful film that I recommend if you want to teach about deculturalization, and then the thinking together with students while bridging back to that bigger issue of what's happening to immigrant communities today. I'm sorry, let me move forward. And then, but the thing that I want to speak to is the pedagogies. And this is a working framework that I did craft in Raza Struggle in the Movement for Ethic Studies. And for me, there's an arc to the ethic studies work. I'm not talking about the curriculum, I'm talking about how we move with students. One, there's the process of naming the historical conditions and realities that encircle our lives. It's very Freudian, this notion of reading the word and the world. Then there's counter storytelling, is the personalizing of those concepts. What is it in our comunidades? How does it apply to me? How do we create counter spaces to that? So if I'm looking at deculturalization and students are finding that it's very prevalent in schools, but what are counter stories to that? And ultimately, the bigger dimension here is how do we work through this pedagogy to create spaces of healing that are social, collective, spiritual, and psychological. And one of the participants in the smaller group was speaking to this really powerful, and we don't have enough. We should amplify the healing circle, that space inside their cogs. It should be a big one because what I do want to say, it's not an exercise in literary analysis. Often that's what happens in the higher education space. How do we create space so that they personalize, so that they work towards healing? And I will share these slides, but they're working understandings grounded in scholarship about what these aspects mean and why they're central to ethic studies, pedagogies, and creative projects, examples of those from digital storytelling, testimonials. We use a lot of those in my university classes. Photography exhibits, spoken word and poetry, diaspora maps. This is a list of things that have come up learning and working alongside ethic studies high school teachers, but these are things that we can use in other settings as well. And there's a pop-up book that you've seen there, really powerful, the Chicanx pop-up book movement that had surfaced for a bit. And so I want us just to have a brief conversation, and this is what I'm going to end with, about the bridging across different spaces. And then Ariana, because I want to be mindful of the time, that I'll have us stay for 5 more minutes, and I know some people may have to leave and they can leave, but we'll stay a little bit to see where this plática goes. But I do have a question, and these are examples of what it looks like ethics studies in K-12, if you're not familiar. Tends to be a one semester ninth grade course. It's rare we see specific groups, like, for example, Chicanx studies, African, we usually it's this kind of general ethics studies course. And um, in Santa Ana, we have more place-based approaches. What I'm framing is a curriculum that's ethics studies as place. So if you're in the Central Valley, imagine ethics studies of the Central Valley. Like that's what we mean by place-based, rather than just the different groups, different themes, and how do they occur across the groups. But right now, the dominant frames is a one semester ninth grade course. What we're seeing, and I want to just move past this. This is just more information, but these are examples of units I work with students. You get a sense this is using research. It's counter storytelling, telling the story behind the numbers. This was work we did years ago with migrant farm worker students in a summer residential program. And then later work I did with youth, Santa Ana youth, using action research. And again, I'll share this curriculum, but if I may, like the first week and two is this process of naming. So remember I said there's an arc, there's a logic to it, naming our reality, naming our words. We do a lot of academic stuff. Then we move into the counter storytelling. And here, because it's research based, it feels like, well, he's doing traditional research, but the way we presented it and the way we told stories about our lived realities, the students wanted to study poverty in this unit. ¿Por qué existe la pobreza? Why does it exist? And why is it rampant? And what is it connected to mental health, to what's going on? But I would argue that it becomes a healing space because often the deficit notions and conceptions of how we place blame on ourselves and our comunidades are what reign. Rarely do we stop and say, no. It's like setting boundaries. No, let me tell you a story of what I learned and what my elders are saying. And so the methodologies are beautiful. These are pictures of students engaged in the process of inquiry. And the creative aspects, I did the haiku poem a student made, incarcerated, those living without schooling, searching for escape. So just the pedagogies are how we move. They intersect with the curriculum. But then I guess in this last plática is I want to invite us to think about the pathways with Modesto Junior College in the middle of the regions that you're situated. And I just looked up high schools. I'm not in your locale, but some of the high schools that are feeder into Modesto Junior College. And obviously they also go to CSUs and UCs. And then looking at then the transfer, I was looking at, well, where do they go? Stanislaus State, Fresno, right? SAC. We have UC Merced as well. And so others, but in thinking about ethics studies, and thinking about the requirements. So that's why we also are getting a lot of the need grow in the community college level. It's the CSU Area F requirement, AB 1460. So it's required. And a lot of East community colleges are now saying we're teaching that too. And they should offer it. But how do we bridge all that? This beautiful movement from the requirement in the high school to the requirement that's happening at the college levels. And so that is not an answer I have, but I have these questions for us, and we'll take like 5 more minutes, Ariana. But what we can do is, for the recording purposes, I just want to thank folks for being a part of this. And let me share this, but I'll come back to this because I don't want to leave us without having this conversation. And these are just slides that think about resources that we have. What are things that we can do? Post-bac certificates. Can your community colleges create those if they haven't already? Can they work in dialogue with the school districts? And this is the one at Cal State LA. So what is it that can be done together? And these are other resources that we're making available. And thank you, Ariana, and the grant, High School Ethics Studies, a resource book. It can be used in community college too. And then please take a look at ethicstudiespedagogies.org. And I see folks here, if you want to be a part of this editorial board, you want to contribute, there's some amazing calls right now for 3 issues in the future. So Ariana, I'll share those with you to share with them. You don't have to write a full-fledged, 10,000 word thing. It could be a poem. It could be a testimonial. We're really challenging the traditional notion of what scholarly journals are, and it's an official, legitimate journal. So I want to say thank you, gracias, tla sokamati, and just thank you for the space. And I will go back, Ariana, but we can probably stop the recording now.